Hello, founders. Welcome. I'm super excited today. We're here with Braden, founder and CEO of Resolve. And in essence, Resolve fights medical bills and medical debt. And let me repeat that. Resolve doesn't want you to shirk your responsibilities of paying your medical bills. They just don't want you to be in medical debt. This has been a long time coming in many ways, just because I met Braden as soon as I joined the startups.com community and saw what he was doing, immediately fell in love with what was going on. Super excited. He's just reached a specific milestone that I think just really exemplifies all the hard work, the tenacity, the relentlessness, the resolve, to use the word here, that Braden has for his startup and what he's doing and the problems that he's solving. Braden, I want to say welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to go over everything with you.
You've reached a specific milestone recently. Want to share what just happened?
So we just closed on a funding round of a little over $3 million to really build out product. When I say closed, we got the term sheet, we signed it, we went through diligence, the wires came in the door.
Okay, yes, we didn't want to go out and be hasty and overzealous and count those chickens, if you will. So the money is in the bank. You are now in the next stage. So let's talk a little bit and give people a bit of context before we go in. How long has Resolve been in existence, and how much revenue were you doing, and what was the stage of the round that you just raised?
Yeah, so Resolve's been in existence for a while. I founded the company back, in June of 2019. So it's been about 3 years. At this point, we were doing about a little over $1.5 million run rate per year in revenue. We just raised a seed round of funding, which I know seems a little bit early for $1.5 million in revenue, but we had built a tech-enabled services company, and the seed round of funding was really to turn that into a product company so that we can scale revenue from $1.5 million to 15 and 150 million and more.
All right. And then to provide a little more idea as far as time, how long have you been trying to raise this round?
Yeah, so the thought on this was probably early this year, January and February timeframe. Really took it off in earnest, probably February, March. I got the first hints of a term sheet in April that was finalized in May. And then we went through diligence. Diligence took longer than we had hoped. There were just some questions that we had to answer, and that took probably a month and a half.
Okay.
Before close.
Okay. So 6 to 7 months
Yep.
is what we're talking about. And how much have you raised previously? What was the configuration of the company before you raised this round?
Yeah, so I've raised a very small pre-seed round, about $300,000, to essentially bootstrap the company and build it up to profitable growth. There were two things we were trying to prove initially. One, that people, we know that there's a massive problem with medical debt. We wanted to prove that people would actually pay for a solution. And two was that we could actually drive a solution in an efficient manner, which we did. And then so now we went out and raised our next round.
Perfect. Okay. So then let's talk about Resolve. So I have your latest pitch deck here, and it's very familiar to me because we've gone back and forth on this, and it was like just watching your evolution, your journey right from the beginning. To me, it's been just inspiring, just awe-inspiring for me, and I can't say enough about how much of a sponge you are, how tenacious, and how much you apply feedback, but not in a, oh, I'm just going to take whatever you say as gospel, but you seriously put everything that you learned through your own mental models and paradigms. And here you are. This is the pitch deck. And so let's talk about the problem statement. 1 in 3 Americans struggle with 1 trillion in medical debt that they can only solve through one of 3 options: pay with credit cards, declare bankruptcy, or ignore collections, wait for legal action. What's the story behind this? Like, how did you get on this idea? How did you get here?
Yeah, so this went through an enormous number of iterations. I don't actually remember everything or exactly what I had in the initial problem statement, but it was nothing like what we had here, right? So the problem statement that I was trying to, what we ended up doing based on your advice and advice from Will and others at startups.com was we want to size the problem, make it show just how massive a big problem it is, quantify it, and then show how poor the other alternatives were, right? And so there's actually quite a bit on this slide. And so we, not only we have to figure out, we want to get a quantifiable size to show the alternatives, we also had to trim that down to be succinct, quick, something you could say in 10 seconds.
And what's your personal story and connection? Most founders have a deep connection some way with the problem that they're trying to solve, either through personal experience or domain expertise. What about you? What's your personal story?
Yeah, so the idea for this actually came from personal experience dealing with a medical bill and basically spending 12 months bashing my face against a brick wall, trying to understand what was going on, why it was so big, and how to get it solved. And I eventually got it solved, but it got me thinking there's got to be a better way to do this. And so I actually started this journey by reaching out to existing medical billing advocates and essentially volunteering to help build their business. Now, it's a little weird for somebody to go do that. And so a lot of medical billing advocates, and most medical billing advocates, by the way, are sole proprietors. So they're just doing this, trying to make a living at it, but don't really have broad business sense on how to scale this. Most people refuse because they're a little suspicious. I found somebody who was willing to take the chance, ended up 10xing her revenues over a 3-month period. And so it got me thinking, okay, there's a way to really launch this. And so then raised a small pre-seed round of funding, as I mentioned, and launched Resolve.
Okay. you kind of said all this super casually, but it's so important what you did there. You had an itch. You said, I want to go scratch it. But you also then went out into the industry and experienced the industry. And that was your MVP, to go and 10x this organization's revenue from medical advocacy to validate or invalidate. You didn't just do it in your mind. You didn't just go talk to customers. You didn't even just talk to customers or pitch the idea. You went right to the front lines to see if this was even a feasible idea. And then with that, you didn't even have a product. You didn't even build software. Like, how much did you actually have to raise your pre-seed $300,000?
Oh, I had a pitch deck that was like, I did have that experience, right, of actually doing it previously. So I don't want to discount that at all, right? Like, that was super helpful and super important.
Yeah.
But then I had a pitch deck. I didn't even have the company name. It's just that I've done this. This is what happened. Here's all the data on the last 3 months. I'm going to go do this and work on building more scale.
I love it. That's fantastic. You went, like I said, you went right to the front lines. So many people or founders, what they'll do is they'll try and build something and kind of sit behind their product, and they'll say, well, I'm just going to put it out in the interwebs and it should start selling itself. You got right there. You got your like hands dirty with the work, which is absolutely fabulous. Question for you before we continue: what's your personal background before becoming a founder?
So I've been in startups for most of my career. I started my career actually on Capitol Hill. It caused me to run in the exact opposite direction because while I learned a ton, government moves at an absolutely glacial pace. Joined a renewable energy startup for any type of funding. We ended up raising a decent seed round, and I built and ran product and operations and project management for that company. Went to business school, and then after business school, built and ran product, where I launched the MVP, and then growth and operations for a VC-funded ed tech company.
Okay. How helpful do you think it is for founders to have actual startup, like working in startup experience before they become founders themselves?
I think it was massively helpful, right? Like, you're constantly under the gun, constantly operating under ambiguity. You constantly have to make decisions. You have to gather the best data you have and then go with it, right? And that can be really difficult for people who have been working in large companies, are used to being able to take their time, get all the data they need, have a ton of resources to go do so. I had built my career in a resource constrained environment where we had to move fast, we had to make decisions, we had to get what we could on the data that we could, make a decision, and then run hard at it.
Okay. Then let's talk about your whole approach to validating your idea and raising your pre-seed deck, which I think is just absolutely fabulous. Was this just a natural inclination? Did you just piece it together yourself, or did you actually learn in your experience in startups how to validate an idea and pitch it and make sure that you've got that validation, some form of traction, something for people to latch on to? How did you learn how to do that?
So it's a really good question. I think it's both learning from prior startup experience, talking to people who I thought might have been interested in investing before I actually went and did my trial, and just sort of having that willingness to put myself out there and go figure things out, right? So I've seen something similar to this in previous startups. I've also worked in startups where we didn't do this. We tried to just build product, and we probably built product too early rather than doing enough customer and market discovery first. But when talking to people about my idea and my thoughts, a few of them were saying, well, why don't you just go find someone who's doing this, partner with them, and actually see if you can do that. Now, that can be really difficult for a lot of people, but for me, like, as part of the startup, like, building my career in startups, that was just pretty natural. I was always having to do things like that. So I just did that. I started reaching out to people to see if they'd partner with me.
That's amazing. Never hurts to start talking to people.
Yeah.
That is for sure. As early as possible. A lot of founders, they'll ask me, like, when should I start, pitching or talking about my startup? And I'll say yesterday. And yesterday is a great time to start. Today, okay, you're a little late, but it never hurts to start talking, because you really begin to gather the edges around your idea. And then all these little ideas, this continuous iterative feedback loop starts to happen before you start spending. Like if you had just taken 300 grand of your own money and said, I'm just going to, chalk it in, you would not have gained the valuable experience to get where you are today. And I think that's a valuable lesson.
Yes, agreed.
Let's talk about the solution then. Our software automates an overwhelming process, providing an average 65% savings and freeing patients from crippling debt. And you just put your 3 steps here: patient intake, analysis reduction, debt resolution. All right. So walk us through what is the state of the product right now? How does it work? What experiences have you had?
Yeah, well, so this is what we're building for the product. We just closed on our funding round to actually go build this. Right now, it's far more manual, right? So patients will reach out to us. We have a team of salespeople who will run through the situation, help the patient understand what's going on and determine a path forward, and then sign them up with us. Then we have a team of operations people that goes out and executes. So the idea behind this slide is this is what we want to make the product. Snap a picture, answer a few questions, we find savings, we pass that on to you so you can move on with your life.
Okay. So we're going to illustrate something here. The whole concept of do things that don't scale. And so many founders get wrapped up in automation, scalability. How's this going to, become scalable? I can't do this, type thing. But, and so important, you went and you raised $300,000, and you didn't even build the software. You created a solution, and it was manual, made sure there were those magic moments, made sure that you could get to that number of 65% debt reduction. And you did it all manually, learning the whole time. And you gathered enough traction, just manually, validation, where the investor now says, all right, I believe you. I believe that if I give you my $3 million, not only do you have the domain expertise, but you have what it takes to build a team, run a team, grow a team, and make sure that the right software solution gets built. That's such an important lesson, because again, how many founders go out there and they chunk 150 grand of their retirement savings into building some software, and then they don't know they've got features. Well, and I'm guilty of this. They've built features that don't work, etc. What was your experience, or what advice would you give to other founders who like have a solution and want to take that same manual, do things that don't scale until we start building the software process?
I mean, I think that's great. But the other thing that it forces you to do, and that I was struggling with previously, is focus on the features and the things that actually matter. Right? Like when you're starting, when you think about starting a company, you've got all these things you want to do. You want to pull features and do everything all at once. You can't do that. It's a boil the ocean approach. You have to focus on what actually matters the most to customers. Then you can scale from that. Doing things manually forces you to focus on that because there's no way in hell you can do everything you want to do. So you have to cut out the stuff that customers don't really want from you. And I think that was a super valuable lesson for us. Like I have all these ideas on all the other things that we could do regarding medical bills and medical debt, and hopefully we'll get there. But that's not on the near-term roadmap.
And what kind of team did you have? Because a lot of founders, they'll get lost in their own head. How did you make sure that you were properly focused? Like, how did you surround yourself with an execution team to make sure, or even just people that you could bounce ideas off of? What did you do?
Yeah, so I think there's two levels there on that question. One is the execution team, right? I've got a team of salespeople and a team of operations people helping me actually drive forward on this. That we just focused on people who were very strongly mission aligned with what we wanted to do. At the same time, I never really stopped networking and just reaching out to people, talking about my idea. Even after raising the $300,000 pre-seed round previously, I was still reaching out to experts in the space to try to understand what was going on. There's been a couple VC funded companies in the space. I talked to the CEOs and lead investors of most of them to understand what's going on. And so continually building up that network of people who have experience, can give good advice, and are at some level vested in giving good advice, right? Like if you can get people excited about what you're doing, they'll want to help you along. They'll want to see you succeed. So just continually doing that. Like I would say, at any given time, at least 20% of my job is just to go out and reach out to people in the industry, talk to them, build awareness, but also build understanding of what's going on, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and get advice.
That's fantastic. And what advice would you give? How do you reach out to people? It's just random LinkedIn, or people introducing themselves to you? You going out on the street, networking events? How'd you do it?
I mean, so you start with your own network, right? Talk about what you can do. When you talk to somebody within your network, understand who's in their network, understand what specifically type of advice in what areas you'd like, maybe suggest some people in the network, or ask for people or for them to intro you, but you need to be very specific on what you're looking for, what type of advice you're looking for, right? To help people along, make those intros. The other thing I think is building sort of that 2 to 3 sentence elevator pitch, right? Like I did actually start reaching out to people cold on LinkedIn. And if you can get them excited about what you're doing in 2 sentences, they're far more likely to respond to you. That can focus your conversation, that can then scale from there.
Okay. How about co-founders? Solo founder, co-founders, what's the configuration?
So I'm a solo founder. I would not recommend anybody ever solo found. I would say find a co-founder. I haven't done so to date. I was so gung-ho on building this that I just didn't care about finding a co-founder before we launched. I just wanted to launch and get going.
Yeah, that's an interesting conversation. Let's break this down for a second. Tell me what you think, because you have experience and you've seen this before. I always recommend, if you can, get a co-founder in the early stages when you're dreaming up the ideas, you're discussing. Don't just shotgun a marriage with co-founders, but in the early stages, you can actually afford to wait. And I always recommend waiting, like talk, mash it through. How about this? How about that? And go through that together. And that way you can really find someone who's as passionate about you and doesn't bring overlap to the table in terms of skill sets. But then finding a co-founder now, it's not like Braden, you're going to go out there and offer up hey, I'm going to give 50% of the way company for someone to come in and, conveniently take away some of my headaches or, different things like that. So you're in a bit of a different situation where most likely you're going to end up sort of, bringing employees and then incentivizing them to act like co-founders, but they're never going to get to a 50-50 place of ownership and partnership with you. What do you think?
I think that's likely correct, right? It's a little bit harder to get to a co-founder now. I think you're absolutely correct. Founding a company is like getting married. You can't just do it quickly. You have to really spend time working through things, making sure that you're both passionate, aligned. Generally speaking, if you're constantly butting heads, that's not great. There should be disagreements and there should be healthy discussions, but you generally want to be aligned. You want to make sure that you like the person that you're working with a lot, because you're going to be spending more time with them than your significant other in most likely. You also have to trust that person. Like, I think the two biggest benefits to having a co-founder, which I didn't have, were one, they can take off a slice of the business and just own it, and then you can sort of not have to worry too much about it and say, oh, my co-founder has it. Yes, we'll have discussions on it, but I don't have to stress about that. Whereas I had to spend time stressing about every aspect of the business as we grew it. And the second is, quite frankly, it's emotional support, right? Like, when you're in the trenches, things are really, really hard. Your employees don't, like, many, and my employees are great. They're absolutely phenomenal, but it's still not quite the same. They're employees. They don't have that responsibility if things go south. And my advisors, well, a great network, are not in the trenches with me. They can sort of remove themselves from things a little bit, so they don't have to deal with the same stresses with dealing with things day to day. So having that other person sort of in the trenches and mesh and everything, who also has to deal with that stress, can actually be hugely helpful.
Okay, let's dream a little bit. Imagine you meet, like, someone shows up, hopefully watches this video. You're looking for a head of product. That's what I heard. And then you're also looking for like a head of talent, someone to help you.
Well, I'm looking for a chief of staff.
Oh, chief of staff.
Who's going to work. We're
Gotcha.
doing a lot of talent work.
Lots of, operational, type stuff, kind of an all-encompassing, you working with your people. You get some candidates and they are so jacked, super excited to come work for you, and they want to get to a place where they're incentivized. They're not expecting you to treat them like they're there at ground zero right from day one. How do you plan on incentivizing them and all of your staff? I'm sure you have to work this through with your investor as well.
Yeah, I mean, so we do give equity as part of the compensation package, right? So we had previously the equity compensation had to be revised over time, but that's how we incentivize our employees. So somebody, let's just take the head of product, right? Like, somebody who's really senior, they'll come on as an employee, they'll get cash plus equity. Over time, if things work out and we continue to work really, really well together, there's sort of that opportunity to become more co-founder-like and take on and get additional equity over time to properly incent them to think like a co-founder.
Then I'm curious, because in my experience, companies, and you don't have to divulge, you can just kind of affirm or reaffirm or correct my thinking here. In my experience, typically startups should allocate or be thinking about allocating between 10 and 20% for their employees. And then often what will happen is when a VC, institutional capital, will come in, they'll actually, as part of the term, say you must allocate that amount, and it has to be official, just to make sure the cap table is really structured. What do you think about that, and what did you end up doing, if you want to divulge?
Yeah, so absolutely. So that's what we did in the pre-seed round. We actually had an allocation for employees. It was really, really large, and we used equity as a major incentive for more senior employees for the pre-seed round. As part of the seed round, yes. As part of the term sheet, there was a very specific percent of the company that needed to be allocated as an employee option pool.
Okay, and if you can, give us a little bit of idea and describe what's your investor like, as much as you can avail.
So the new investor, the new lead, I like them a lot. They're very friendly, very helpful. We actually sit down and work through and strategize through problems quite frequently. But at the same time, they're not trying to sit there and dictate what needs to be done. They still recognize that I'm the CEO and I've got to make the decisions and drive things forward. And so the relationship has been really, really good so far. And so I'm really excited by having them. Another thing that I'll say about our new lead investor. One of my friends from business school is an entrepreneur in residence there. He views VCs, generally speaking, very suspiciously. He's had some not great experiences with them. And so for good reason, he views them suspiciously. He was like, these guys are nothing like other VCs at all. They're completely different. I trust them in the ways I don't trust other VCs. And so I think that spoke volumes for me as well.
Okay, so that networking component comes in again. You can never be networked enough because you just never know what type of inside information. And yes, the horror stories, unfortunately, I'll end up talking with founders, and in a moment of transparency, I will start to tell them horror stories of working with venture capital, and their eyeballs will go really big, and they'll say, I can't believe this stuff happens, even, all the way down to a family office and an angel level, and with angel networks, because capital has become so professional, so organized. It wasn't like back in the day where, you'd sit at a bar and draw on a napkin, and literally I've seen people raise money that way. It's so organized with general partners, limited partners, and investment theses, and, things like that. And they kind of say, well, I thought all venture capital was friendly. And I just say, no, it's not. So it's refreshing to hear that you found something different. That must have been
at
a
least
great
I hope so, right? Like,
yeah,
venture capital, their primary focus is making their LPs money, right?
exactly.
Like that, when that lines up with what you're doing in building a really big, successful business, it works out great. But it doesn't always line up exactly with what you're doing. And in those instances, I'm sure that's where the horror stories start to materialize.
100%. And then on top of which, what you're talking about, building a big company, and so many founders don't understand, these VCs need to hit home runs. They need to, it's just kind of like a movie studio. They have to bank on finding that Harry Potter franchise, or, different things like that, the Marvel movies, etc. And even though they may make a lot of other movies, it's just a machine to drive profit for all the investors. So one of the ways that you do that is you make sure that you're in the proper size market. So let's get to this next slide here. This to me was really insightful when I first saw it, because for me, what I'm always looking for when I'm looking through pitch decks is, how much unique and novel insight does the founder provide to me, where I say, okay, I understand the problem, I understand the solution, which you did, really well, to go, okay, this is super simple. But then you broke down the market based upon the size of debt, because, we'll talk about this in a moment. You, in essence, charge a percentage of what you save them. So this made natural sense to show this. And then you came down, and so 1 trillion, $40 billion of medical debt above $10,000. How did you find this data?
Yeah, so there is data on number of people with medical debt in different size buckets, right? And so if you assume the average debt size is somewhere in the mid-range of that size bucket, you multiply it by the number of people with debt in that bucket, and you can come up with the total market size. And so that's the data that we pulled and then broke down.
Okay. And how much did your investors, when you're pitching, how much did they beat this up, if at all?
Almost not at all, right?
Yeah.
Like, if somebody disagrees that there's $100 trillion of medical debt out there, they think it's 300 to 500 billion, right?
Sure.
Like, they're looking at an enormous market size, no matter what way you slice it. So,
yeah.
I had the luxury of operating in an enormous market where any investor who's interested realized that it was an enormous market, and so I didn't really get beat up on this.
Okay.
At all.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay. So current traction, we talked about this. You've aggregated $250 million of medical debt while successfully servicing 25 million. Had 2 million revenue and have 20 employees. Our goal for the next round is to move to 1 billion aggregation and 250 million in debt service breakdown. So, you broke that apart. So here's the business model. So then, you're taking a percentage of savings, et cetera. How iterative was this, or how many times did you play around with your business model? Like, what was the journey here?
Yeah, so I had a pretty good idea of what I was going to present as the business model in the slide deck, largely because I had 3 years to actually work in it and work through it, right? And so when I say, like, in building the slide deck, that didn't get, like, the business model itself didn't get played around with too much, but that's because I spent 3 years thinking through this. And we adjusted our business model multiple times over those 3 years. But I will point out that one of the key things I'm thinking about right now is that business model that I presented and other ways to make things more efficient and more friction-free for patients while providing more value to them. So it's while I didn't kill myself on this, it is a nonstop process that you need to be thinking about very heavily.
Okay. Yeah. So you played around with it. 10 to 25% of savings. Okay. 10% of signups qualified. Like, all the data is there, which is absolutely fantastic. Here's how it works. You kind of described it. Again, we were doing things in a way that you were doing a manual process, which is great. Customer acquisition. Now, this is something that I remember a lot, really having some in-depth discussion on. And it was sort of a point where this was a kind of a challenging part. Like, talk about what challenges you faced in building this out, then presenting it with investors, and finally getting that point where they were like, okay, we get it, type thing.
Yep. I mean, look, investors always want you to have a customer acquisition strategy, right? Like, you can't just go out in the wilderness and shotgun blindly. At the same time, at the seed stage, you don't really know your customer acquisition strategy because you don't really understand things at scale enough. You really haven't played around with different tactics, different channels, different strategies to understand how they scale. And so we were kind of in that where we were acquiring customers. We had some visibility into the tactics, but we weren't exactly sure how everything would scale well. And a lot of investors were like, I want to know very specifically how this is going to scale, what these costs are going to be. And part of my problem was, well, I can make up those numbers, but really part of this round is to figure that part out. And so I went back and forth on it a lot. There's a lot on that slide. It's probably not the greatest slide, but the general idea there was, hey, look, we've got a broad scale strategy. We've executed on stage 1 of the strategy, and this is how we get to stage 2 and stage 3, with it being broad enough that we'll be able to adjust it over the next 18 months as we prepare for our Series A.
In your experience up to this point in time, through your years of operation, how much word of mouth do you receive?
Yeah, so in the beginning, it was very small, right? Because we had just launched, but that's actually scaling significantly. As we've served more and more people and helped more and more people. And so we're at a point where we're seeing a 75% month over month increase in referrals.
Wow.
And so it's actually starting to scale to a noticeable amount.
Sure.
Right now.
Okay. Let's break this down for a second, because I think it's important. It's like a solid reality check for founders. One, you have to build a product that's magical enough, people love, and people will talk about it. But that in of itself, although a really great sign indicator, in of itself will not get you the investment, because we all know you have to go into hyper growth. Great sign, a great major foundational piece for product market fit, but then you couldn't just put on your slide, oh, we get 75%, word of mouth, like month over month growth, and we're just network effects. That's how we're going to grow, right? That's not good enough for investors at this level. They're going to write a $3 million check. They are really going to beat you up on not only how are you going to acquire more customers and accelerate that, because that is exponential. If you can acquire customers formally with an optimized automated process, and get that word of mouth, then you've got this hockey stick growth. So they're going to beat you up and they're going to say, we need to know how you're going to take this to scale because you are building a unicorn. Those are the conversations that founders are going to get. And so just saying, oh, we get a lot of word of mouth and we have a Facebook page is not going to be good enough. What advice would you give to other founders who are in this situation?
Yeah, so one is really don't talk about word of mouth. We ended up talking about it, but I sort of beat around to get there and said, look, we're in a super unique situation. Most investors don't think word of mouth really happens for a good reason, right? Because virality is super, super difficult to make happen at this point. I think you need to spend an enormous amount of time thinking through this and thinking through your strategy, not just your tactics. If I'm going to go to this channel or this channel, but how are you going to drive interest? And how are you going to actually build what you mentioned is network effects, but a way to actually scale growth, right? So for instance, you can't see the slide right now, but the first part of our slide was digital means, which is basically paid search. And that's how we acquire the majority of our customers today. We actually have a really good user acquisition cost on digital, but that's not scalable. If I said, okay, we're just going to continue scaling paid search, investors would say, okay, but like, you're not going to get that big. By doing that, you've got to figure out how to hockey stick your way up. And so building up a clear, concise strategy on how to really hockey stick that growth, I think is super important. But that's also super hard to do. And I'll just say, as you mentioned, I talked to you about this. I talked to other people in the startups.com community pretty heavily about this, trying to figure out how do we present this in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, and that was a great exercise. Again, the more questions you ask, the more discussion. Braden's the type of guy who will message you and he'll say, hey, can you meet right now? Or like, how fast can you meet? And say weekends, doesn't matter, weird hours, let's just do it. And that doesn't, for us, and I'll just, kind of lift the curtain a little bit. For us on the startups.com side, the team, we were so excited. We were celebrating that, and we were talking to each other, and we're like, Braden needs to meet who can take this meeting, type thing as soon as possible. Again, it doesn't bother us because we know when founders are one, onto something, and two, have that intensity of execution, the relentlessness, the resourcefulness to really hammer this home and to figure out this problem, which we call the idea maze, or Andreessen Horowitz calls it the idea maze. And so you've obviously thought through customer acquisition, but then you thought through the competitive landscape. So that's where you are before. And now this is where I find this super interesting, because normally when people put out this quadrant model, it's like, bam, you're the only one in the quadrant, but you've got other startups in the space. So what are your thoughts around this?
Yeah, so I wanted to be very clear that we're not the only ones tackling this, but I also use this as an opportunity to differentiate on why we would actually be successful and other startups wouldn't, right? And so, like I mentioned earlier in this video, I had talked to the founders and lead investors of a couple of the startups, CoPatient and Remedy. Notably, I understood what their major problems were and the reasons why they either had to sell or wind the company down. And so I was able to use that as a way to differentiate Resolve from other companies that have tried to do this in the past.
Gotcha. So these companies, Goodbill and Remedy, are not in business anymore. That's what you're saying?
So Remedy is not in business anymore. Goodbill is. They actually just raised, I think, about a $3 million seed. So we're competitive with them. That being said, we've saved people. I know the traction slide had about 15 million, but that's old. It's about $20 million today. We know how to do it. We built up the workflows to do it. So we think we've got a massive advantage over Goodbill that's just getting into the market.
Okay, perfect. Another important thing for founders, you have to know your competitors, but don't freak out if you've got another competitor in your space. It's actually, if it's a big enough problem, $1 trillion worth of a problem, having more players in the space is actually a sign of validation. Lots of pie to go around. And, if you just do a fraction of that, 1% of the, total addressable market, well, you're still going to be absolutely successful. It's going to be a great story. So don't be deterred, but knowing your competition is super important. So I'm sure you got grilled pretty hard on your understanding competitors.
Yes.
Here's your team. Okay. And which is great. So you've been building this over a period of time. And so, sort of having that background is great. We have 20 full-time employees and a host of core advisors, which is great. Your funding and your milestones was there. You put your financials, future growth, talking about it. Okay. I think this is really great. This is important. A lot of founders don't necessarily think about this, or they kind of overemphasize this when you're pitching. So a real serious investor, one that knows startups, is going to look and say, does the founder and the startup focus? Can they focus on the micro and solve a problem? But after they do that, what's the macro? How is the world going to change? How is this going to be absolutely massive? And it's almost a bit of a paradox, because it's like, well, you want us to just focus micro and dominate a small niche, but what about all the rest that's, going on there? But it is the process and it is the journey. And so you've got this big vision here, in terms of, like, you're putting yourself up and comparing yourself to some pretty big companies there. What are your thoughts about what went into this slide, and what are you trying to convey?
Yeah, so what you had mentioned about sort of the micro and the macro dichotomy, I found very much so during my pitches. Some investors loved this. Some investors felt this was distracting. And so one of the things that I ended up doing is this came after the financial slide. So I would stress, look, our 5-year plan is we are going to fix medical debt in the US. That is a massive problem. It's going to take us an enormous amount of resources to do, but we will do it. However, once we fix medical debt in the US, we'll earn the trust of hundreds of millions of American consumers. And that'll give us the opportunity to really take over and help them with all aspects of healthcare finances. And then talk about the other ways we can help with healthcare finances.
Okay, some learning lessons there. So not every investor is going to take this the same, but you did put this after the financial slide. So you kind of put this, it's not an afterthought, but it's just appropriately timed type thing. And, like you said, investors are polarized. I can tell you from our standpoint, although we appreciate visionary founders, we worry, like, when we're scouting and, getting to know the founders, that's what we test for. We look for the ability to focus. And so we do worry that, with access to capital, that founders just going to start going ham on building their vision. So I'll talk to founders and I'll say, what is the one slice of the pie, the one problem? Let's pick one persona, one user problem, and make them super happy. Because if you can do that once with one user and make $1, you can do this with millions and make billions of dollars, right? But then they say, but Ed, I want to change the world. I want to go do this and this and this. And that fundamentally makes us queasy. I'd rather hear, and I know you do this, right? I'd rather hear, yeah, we are going to do that. That is our laser focused mission for 5 years. And then we're going to expand beyond that. So I think that's a really great way that you couch that. And it also motivates you as the founder that you're building towards something that big.
Yep.
Okay. Well, there's your slide deck. And just for the sake of time, we don't have a lot of time. So what advice? All right. You've got other founders that, let's just chunk them in a sort of SaaS, and they're trying to do, it's not a SaaS. It's going to be a platform where it's just going to be processing. And you pretty much, it's kind of like your business model is really interesting, in the way that you're going about doing it. They're passionate. The founders are very passionate about this. You want to build software. You're thinking about, okay, I got to raise a bunch of money. Where do they start? What advice would you give to the founders who are watching this? The founders that we've got at startups.com. Like, you spend a lot of time. You've been very generous with giving your advice, what advice would you give to them?
I'm going to give three things. So one is on building the pitch deck. Two is going out networking and raising, and three is following up and continuing to iterate on the pitch deck. So the first thing on the pitch deck, Will was extraordinarily helpful on this, is just be super concise. Nail your problem, nail your solution. That actually serves as the guide for the rest of the pitch deck. Like I went through this too. You build a pitch deck and you're almost you want to go off in a million different directions. You have all this knowledge that you have that you want to convey on the pitch deck, but like it's not the time. Like your pitch deck is a hype deck. You can't lie, but it's a hype deck. You need to be very focused because too much information confuses VCs. And I'll say I've seen a few pitch decks where you can see it's a little bit in the earlier stages because there's just a lot of information that I'm trying to process quickly. Like as an example, I use DocSend to send out my pitch decks, which actually show me how much time any given person, like anybody spent on a slide. The average VC spent about a minute 30 on my pitch deck overall. And, some of the slides that get 20 seconds on, most of the slides were 3 to 5 seconds before they moved on to the next slide. So you've got to be able to convey your information in 3 to 5 seconds. I would say
huge insight.
As I was doing this, I showed this to one of my friends who's raised money before. I didn't get past the solution slide before he closed the computer. I was just like, this is way too much information. I can't process it. You've got to simplify. And that was super helpful to me. So the second is networking, right? Like I am fortunate I do have a reasonably good network. So I was able to go out and network and find people who were interested in what we're doing. But like I was doing cold outreach to people occasionally, right? Sending LinkedIn messages, talking about what we're doing. And so just continue to network, put yourself out there, go to conferences, just go meet people, get people excited about what you're doing. And then following up, I actually talked to a couple of VCs about this who had some pretty good feedback about their concerns. And I was very lucky that I was able to get reasons for a no in many cases. Now, how much those reasons actually matter versus, generally I don't like this, I'm not going to invest, I don't know, but they were helpful in guiding my thinking on continuing to craft and iterate the pitch deck. And so just continue to take that feedback into account, make sure that you're processing it properly. Don't just do exactly what everyone tells you to do, because then you're going to go in a million different directions, but like process it with everything else and then figure out whether or not it needs to be put into the deck.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, Braden, I can't congratulate you enough. I'm so looking forward to seeing this journey, and I appreciate how transparent and at times vulnerable that you've been, just sharing in our office hours and the different group meetings that we've had. It's been a pleasure to get to know you. So what's next for you?
Well, we've got 18 months, so we try to raise a Series A. Right. So I've been building out the path forward to this is what we need to do to get to the Series A. Here's what we need to do quarter by quarter to get there. And then executing on that quarter, which is a lot of hiring and a lot of execution work.
Yeah. Let's give a shout out to Will. Will has done an amazing job just breaking down that pitch deck perfection course and, boiling everything down there. Again, shout out everybody watching. You should really check all that out. And then also understand that when we're breaking down your pitch decks and, a lot of times it comes across mean and we're giving feedback, we're only giving you the tip of the iceberg on what you're going to experience. And we'd rather have you experience that with us than get in front of investors and then not be able to handle that or understand or have that similar type situation. So last question for you. How many rejections did you get before you got that term sheet?
I'd have to go back and look. Over 10.
Over 10. Yeah. And you built a company that had already been doing significant revenue and things like that. It's not like you're just a small fish just with a pitch deck and idea and sort of without reality going on. You were building the business, but you just went. And then how many times did you pitch to, would you say? Like practice, like how many?
With practice and with friends and talking about it. 100.
Hundreds.
Easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, again, this has been absolutely fantastic. Braden, how can people get a hold of you? You're super busy. How do you want people to get a hold of you? If they want to, what would they do?
Yeah, so message me on Slack,
Okay.
startups.com Slack. I will get to it even if it's not immediate. I've got a million things going on, but if you direct message me there, I will get to it.
Absolutely. We're gonna kind of be protective of Braden's time because we need him focused on a startup. It's been fantastic, but you heard it here. Join the startups.com community or get onto the startups.com Slack and then message Braden. That's the best way to get a hold of him. Braden, thanks again. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you very much, Ed. It's great chatting. And I appreciate everything that you guys have done also to get me here. I do want
Always.
to point out that that was super, super helpful
Always.
getting to where we are.